Tonight, we have NVN member Richard Senerchia doing his Beethoven program. Richard is a lifelong musician, composer, and teacher. His junior high school music teacher sparked his love of Beethoven by using Beethoven's Fifth Symphony to illustrate the structure of a symphony. The following summer, Richard began taking piano lessons, which he loved. He went on to study music composition in college. Now, 60 years later, his fascination with music and musicians, especially Beethoven, continues unabated.
And this is a bit silly, this cartoon, because it says what you can or cannot do. Just look at Beethoven. Everyone told him he would never be a musician just because he was deaf. But did he listen? And the problem with this is that Beethoven wasn't born deaf. He became deaf only in his late 20s, and he was already a musician by that time. So I called this talk Beethoven, His Life and Times. It's not really about his music. It's about himself and the world that he lived in. This is a portrait of Beethoven done from life. I wonder if I can go. It's the only portrait done of Beethoven from life, and it now hangs in the Beethoven House in Bonn, which is partly because Beethoven was born in Bonn. He was born in 1770. His father was named Johann. His mother was Maria. He had two younger brothers, Johann and Karl. His first teachers were his father and this guy, Christian Neefe, or Neefe. Neefe was an interesting guy, which we'll hear more about in a little bit. The first time he went to Vienna, and Vienna was like the epicenter of cultural life at the time. The first time he went to Vienna was in 1786, and he finally moved to Vienna permanently in 1792. Here's some important dates, which, if you don't worry about remembering these because I got a little timeline coming up. But 1769 was the birth of Napoleon. Napoleon and Beethoven's stories kind of crisscrossed through their lives. Beethoven was born in 1770. 1789 was the French Revolution. In 1827, Beethoven died. Some more dates. The birth of Haydn. Haydn was a contemporary of Mozart's father, and he was born in 1732. Mozart himself was born in 1756 and died in 1791. And Haydn, who lived a very long life for the time he was born, died in 1809. And then there's something called the Congress of Vienna, which is important later on. That's 1814 to 1815. Here's that timeline I mentioned. Haydn was born, Haydn dies. Mozart was born, and Mozart dies. Napoleon was born, and Napoleon died. Beethoven was born, and 1797 maybe, Beethoven began to lose his hearing, and he died finally in 1827. The French Revolution happened in there in 1789. The Congress of Vienna was sometime later. But that's the sort of political milieu that Beethoven was living in. Oops, can't look at that yet. Have to start talking. So he was the eldest of three surviving sons in Bonn, which is in present-day Germany, but then was the capital of the Electorate of Cologne. There were these various electorates. Electors were the people whose job it was to vote for the new Holy Roman Emperor when one was needed. And so the Electorate of Cologne was the rather important guy. Anyway, he was born in 1770, a year after the birth of Napoleon, as I think I said, 19 years before the French Revolution in 1789. His father was a minor court musician, a tenor. He was an alcoholic whose problem worsened with age. He pushed Ludwig to practice and hoped his son would be another Mozart. You know, Mozart at this time was 14. Mozart had electrified Europeans with his amazing abilities, and I think Beethoven's father was understandably hoping his talented son would become another Mozart. Beethoven's father used to come home from drinking bouts, often bringing a drinking buddy with him, and wake up Beethoven in the middle of the night and ask him to play the piano for them. That's the kind of childhood he had. Ludwig's grandfather, though, also named Ludwig, was a Kapellmeister. That would be a music director for a local dignitary. He was Kapellmeister of to the Elector of Cologne, so it was an important job. And Beethoven revered him all his life. Wherever he lived, Beethoven kept a portrait of his grandfather on display, though he never kept a portrait of his father. And in fact, he chose not to attend his father's funeral. He first visited Vienna in 1786, sponsored by the Elector of Cologne on account of his promising musical abilities. And at that first visit, he met Mozart, who was 14 years his senior. And I think he played for Mozart, although Mozart did not record much about the meeting at the time. But shortly afterwards, he was called home to Bonn by his father because his mother was dying of tuberculosis. And then he returned to Vienna in 1792 and spent the remainder of his life there. By then, he had mastered much of the keyboard music of Johann Sebastian Bach and become a formidable pianist. He also, as was common in those times, had become an accomplished improviser of the keyboard. In his early years in Vienna, he was known primarily as a brilliant pianist and improviser. The classical musicians at the time were expected to be able to improvise, whereas now improvising classical musicians are relatively rare. When after his father, Beethoven's first teacher was Christian Neefe. Didn't we see his picture back here a little ways? Yeah, there he is. Christian Neefe. He was a German opera composer and conductor. He was court organist in Bonn and was the principal piano teacher of Beethoven. He helped Beethoven produce some of his first works, and it's likely he influenced on Ludwig's appreciation for the ideals of the Enlightenment, because in Bonn, Neefe became prefect of the local chapter of the Illuminati. The Illuminati historically were an Enlightenment era secret society. Their stated goals were to oppose superstition, obscurantism, religious influence over public life, and abuses of state power. The order of the day, they wrote in their general statutes, is to put an end to the machinations of the purveyors of injustice, to control them without dominating them. The Illuminati, along with Freemasons and other secret society, were outlawed through edict by Charles Theodore, the Elector of Bavaria, with the encouragement of the Catholic Church. Well, you can imagine that with stated goals like those, that they were not endearing themselves to the establishment. During subsequent years, the group was generally vilified by conservative and religious critics who claimed that the Illuminati continued underground and were responsible for the French Revolution. The movement of the Illuminati attracted literary men such as Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, so it's not to be taken lightly. And Neefe also introduced Beethoven to the music of Johann Sebastian Bach, especially the well-tempered clavier, as I said. All his life, as we'll hear later, Beethoven adhered to the ideals of the Enlightenment, and so I think his first teacher, Neefe, made a terrific impression on him. In those days, Europe was ruled by monarchs and aristocrats. When Beethoven was born in 1770, the Holy Roman Emperor was Joseph II, an enlightened ruler. Catherine the Great ruled Russia. Frederick II, also known as the Great, ruled Prussia. Louis XV sat on the throne in France. George III ruled England. And musicians of the previous generation, like Franz Joseph Haydn, whose dates I'm sure you remember were 1732 to 1809, and Leopold Mozart, father of Wolfgang, were little more than servants living mainly through the patronage of wealthy aristocrats. Okay, now I showed you those dates, didn't I? Let's go back to those, just in case you've forgotten. Those are important dates in the story we're telling. Okay, not that yet. Okay. The Baroque era was ending at this time, That was the 17th and early 18th centuries. It emphasized complexity and emotional intensity, and it was ending. Bach and Handel, late Baroque composers, were born in 1680 and died in 1750 and 1759, respectively. The new style, which was called classicism, was heavily influenced by the aesthetic ideals of the Enlightenment: clarity, simplicity, balance, and the desires of noble patrons for music that was easy to follow, pleasant, calm, and restrained. And those noble patrons were paying the bills, so that's important, that they tended to get the music that they wanted. There's a story about Haydn that in his output, he fell under the sway of a movement called the Sturm und Drang movement. That means storm and stress. And his music began to be more emotionally intense. But his patron, let me see, Nicholas Esterhazy was his patron. He was an aristocrat. He came to Haydn and he said, I'm not crazy about the new music. Can we go back to something a little simpler? And suddenly Haydn's style changes again, changes back to the lighter, more gallant, less challenging kind of music. Because, as I say, the patrons were the ones who influenced what happened in the arts. Haydn characterized the ideals of the classic period in these words: passions, violent or not, must never be expressed to the point of disgust, and music must never offend the ear, even in the most horrendous situations, but must always be pleasing. In other words, always remain music. As an example of this, I want you to listen to a bit of Haydn's Symphony Number 9, the Surprise Symphony. And Lawrence, can you play that first clip? So that was the kind of music that was. We're not going to listen to Eine kleine Nachtmusik or to Beethoven. That was the kind of music that aristocrats preferred: simple, quiet, and in fact, you heard a loud chord at the end. Haydn himself said about that, that is where the ladies will scream. And the idea that a sudden loud chord might cause ladies in the audience to scream lets you know how genteel and refined these people were, that they would have been startled by something like a sudden loud chord in a piece of music. It's not like it was then. Anyway, this classical style was the prevalent style in the times of Haydn and Mozart, and also of the young Beethoven. But with the French Revolution in 1789, the social order experienced upheaval. Aristocrats lost power, prestige, and money. In France, they lost more, they lost their heads. And a middle class of tradesmen, merchants, and shopkeepers began to emerge. Musicians had to look for income outside of the patronage of wealthy aristocratic connoisseurs. There began to be public performances for ticket-buying audiences, whereas before, most refined music, that is, aside from folk music or the drinking songs of the taverns and so on, was played in churches or the palaces of the aristocracy. For example, Beethoven wrote 32 piano sonatas, but in his lifetime, only one was ever performed in public. And you have to remember there was no copyright law, so income from sales of sheet music was small, undependable, and varied from country to country. I have here a quote from one of Beethoven's biographers, a man named Maynard Solomon, and I just lost it. Let me see. There it is. With the French Revolution, the chief German courts had presented, until the French Revolution, I'm sorry, I can't read my own, had represented a relatively placid and harmonious surface. The aristocracy that presided over them was imbued with an unshakable belief in its own benevolence and its own way of life and culture. Above all, it was persuaded of the inevitability of its own future. The storming of the Bastille effectively undermined all that. So as a result of the French Revolution, 1789, Napoleon came to power. Europe was subject to a number of wars against the armies of the French, but Napoleon was eventually defeated, finally at Waterloo in 1815, and an attempt was made by the governments of Europe to turn back the clock, to reestablish political security and the primacy of the aristocracies. This was the Congress of Vienna, 1814 to 1815, a gathering of heads of state. Quote from Wikipedia, I think. The Congress of Vienna, 1814 to 1815, was a series of international diplomatic meetings to discuss and agree upon a possible new layout of the European political and constitutional order after the downfall of the French Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte. Participants were representatives of all European powers and other stakeholders, chaired by Austrian statesman Clemens von Metternich, and held in Vienna from September 1814 to 1815. Well, as a consequence, and this is why it relates to Beethoven's life, as a consequence of this effort, governments became conservative, even reactionary, and repressive of any enlightenment or revolutionary thought. Books and plays were censored, mails were read, and spies were everywhere. Conservative leaders like von Metternich also sought to restrain or eliminate Republican, liberal, revolutionary movements, which from their point of view had upended the constitutional order of the European ancient regime and which continued to threaten it. Now, let's take a break from all this history stuff and talk about Beethoven's deafness. These are a sample of Beethoven's various ear trumpets. His deafness began around 1797 and became progressively worse for the rest of his life. To hear music, he relied on devices like these, but for conversations, especially in noisy places like taverns, he used conversation books. So he would have an open book and he would say something, and you would write your response to that in his book. In one of these books, in fact, to illustrate the prevalent atmosphere of repression and censorship, in one of these books, someone replies and says, "Let's not talk about that now because so-and-so is here and he is a known spy." So this guy was trying to say to Beethoven, "Shut up, you're going to get us all in trouble." Beethoven was outspoken and didn't hesitate to speak his mind about the repression of the government, and some of his friends, I think, were a little nervous about the way he talked and shot his mouth off in public because of that. Still, along with the weakening of aristocratic privilege, coupled with the humanism of the Enlightenment, there came a new attitude toward the arts. The individual, my point, the individual came to be, and the artists were viewed now as exalted. Emotional expression became an aesthetic desirable. Freedom of expression became highly valued. And this was the beginning of what we now call the Romantic era. Romanticism was characterized by its emphasis on emotion and individualism, as well as glorification of the past and nature. Now, so Beethoven historically stands astride the transition from the classical era of Mozart and Haydn to the Romantic era of later composers. He's rightly credited as a major harbinger of the Romantic era in the music that followed, but Beethoven never abandoned the fundamental formal paradigms and generally objective artistic philosophy characterizing musical classicism, not to the same extent that later composers did, such as Berlioz or even Schubert. Beethoven's early work was closely modeled on Haydn and Mozart, imbued with the restraints and the ideals of classicism. But now, in Beethoven's so-called middle period, sometimes called his heroic period, and that dates roughly from 1802 to 1814, he created music of greater intensity, heightened emotion, and greater length. His first two symphonies had been 24 and 32 minutes long. The third, the Eroica Symphony, is 46 minutes long. That is twice as long as the first, almost twice as long. It was difficult for the musicians of the time to comprehend and required more rehearsals than they were accustomed to. In those days, a new symphony typically received 2 rehearsals before its premiere. But this new one, and Beethoven's, was too difficult and came off rather badly at first. Beethoven had employed some surprising dissonances, too, which were off-putting to some at first. There is a moment when it sounds like the horns are playing a wrong note. And I wish I could play this for you, but that didn't work out. And also, at the end of there's a point in the symphony at which the audience would have known now it's time to go back to the beginning. But Beethoven plays a theme from the very beginning, a couple measures earlier than you expect to hear it. And in the 19th century, this was thought to be a mistake. Some conductors assumed the notes were written were a mistake on Beethoven's part. Ferdinand Ries, who was an assistant of Beethoven's, shared an anecdote about this horn entrance. The first rehearsal of the symphony was terrible, but the hornist did, in fact, come in on cue. I was standing next to Beethoven, and believing that he had made a wrong entrance, I said, "That damned hornist, can't he count? It sounds frightfully wrong." I believe I was in danger of getting my ears boxed. Beethoven did not forgive me for a long time. So Beethoven was writing music that was challenging for his listeners to hear. Maybe you know this third symphony of Beethoven, which is now known as the Eroica Symphony, was originally named the Bonaparte Symphony. Beethoven himself removed that name from it when Napoleon declared himself emperor. Beethoven, though not a radical or a revolutionary in the political sense, nevertheless retained a lifelong devotion to the Enlightenment ideals of individual freedom and the brotherhood of man. And so when Napoleon declared himself emperor, Beethoven was disgusted and he changed the dedication of the symphony. And the text that he used for the Ninth Symphony, maybe we're getting ahead of ourselves here, but his choral symphony, the Ninth Symphony, was from Friedrich Schiller's Ode to Joy, celebrating, looking forward to the happy day when all humanity would live in harmony. I think I have a slide about that. That's kind of come up. Okay. Yeah. Hold on. There. You see, I have highlighted certain passages that give you the impression of this as being a text that appealed to Beethoven's Enlightenment values. All men will emerge as brothers, where you rest your gentle wings, you being joy. If you master this great challenge, giving friendship to a friend, if you've earned a steadfast woman, celebrate your joy with us. And later on, be embraced, all you millions. Share this kiss with all the world. It's very Enlightenment values and humanitarian values at a time of great repression. Let me see. Here we go. This is a quote from Lewis Lockwood's biography of Beethoven. Against the background of repression of nationalistic movements, Beethoven decided to set Schiller's Ode to Joy as an anthem that could be performed on the grandest possible scale. We all familiar with the Ode to Joy? You know that tune that goes da 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 da. That's Beethoven's setting of Schiller's Ode to Joy. Anyway, he decided to fashion a great work that would convey the poet's utopian vision of human brotherhood. This is a statement of support for the principles of democracy at a time when direct political action on behalf of such principles was dangerous or difficult. Beethoven chose this text in spite of the political climate of repression, partly because he had been thinking about setting it to music since his boyhood. Recall that Enlightenment ideals were very much in the air during Beethoven's youth in Bonn. And in his only opera, which is called Fidelio, the libretto tells of a woman, Leonore, disguised as a prison guard named Fidelio, rescues her husband Florestan from death in a political prison. This scenario fits Beethoven's aesthetic and political outlook, a story of personal sacrifice, heroism, and eventual triumph, Its underlying struggle for liberty and justice mirrors contemporary political movements. Notable moments in the opera include a prisoner's chorus where they sing "Oh, what a joy," an ode to freedom sung by a chorus of political prisoners. Florestan's vision of Leonore come as an angel to rescue him, the scene in which the rescue finally takes place, the finale celebrates Leonore's bravery. This is all really contrary to the spirit of the age, which was a time of great repression. And of course, it also celebrates a woman's daring and courage and fidelity, which is contrary to the spirit of the age, too. This opera did have some trouble getting past the censors. But Beethoven had some powerful friends who pulled strings, and some changes were made. A big plus was that the Empress Maria Theresa of Naples had read and liked the libretto. So that was let me see, where's the next? Okay, I showed you that. We're skipping that. Okay. No, we're not there yet. So Beethoven was one of the first to view his art as more than mere entertainment or craft, but rather as a noble calling. He was among the first to expect his music to live on after him. There's an incident I read about where somebody says to him, he says, "Well, people don't like your new piece of music," and he says, "That's okay. In the future, they'll like it better." So he was taking a long view, which was uncharacteristic of Mozart or Haydn. They wrote music for the moment, for the audience that they were looking at. And Beethoven was not. He was writing music for humanity, for the future, for the sake of art. And that was a very fundamental difference in his attitude towards music. Fortunately, his preference was for instrumental music rather than vocal music, and that made it easier for him to escape censorship. And although he was an outspoken critic of the regime and its censorship, he was never arrested or harassed by the police, probably because the people held him in high esteem, so that they would have been risky to harass Beethoven. Well, there was a third period to his output, the music of his later years when he was increasingly deaf, isolated from society, no longer able to perform as a pianist, but still able to compose. The music he wrote in his last decade or so, he died in 1827 at the age of 56, is still today regarded as challenging to the listener. Lengthy movements, full of jagged rhythms, abrupt changes of mood, startling harmonies, and almost baroque contrapuntal textures. I want to play for a bit one of these pieces of music for you. It's called the Great Fugue. It's a quartet movement, which was described by Igor Stravinsky as music that will always be modern. So can we have the Grosse Fuge? I I hope you're hearing it. I'm not hearing it.
I'm hearing it.
Well, if you didn't hear that, you can go online and listen to the beginning of Beethoven's Great Fugue. I don't know what's going on here.
We're hearing it fine.
I'm sorry?
We're hearing it just fine.
It's fine. Okay, good. Are we done? Because I can't hear it. This movement was meant to be the final movement of a string quartet, Opus 130, but it's 16 minutes long by itself. This would have made that quartet 52 minutes long, and the publisher objected and said, We can't do that. So it was published separately as Opus 133 instead. Last fall, I had the opportunity to hear the Jasper String Quartet, a local group, play this whole quartet in Opus 130, including the great fugue at the end, the way that Beethoven intended it. And I thought it was a wonderful experience. Anyway, that's Beethoven's great fugue and a good example of his last style. We have to talk about Beethoven's deafness. What caused it? And how did he write music when he was deaf? Well, it is not known definitively what caused Beethoven to go deaf. I think I have a slide somewhere. Okay, symptoms of lead poisoning, irritability, and Beethoven was famously irritable. Loss of appetite, I have found nothing in my reading about that. Vomiting, which is reported by friends of Beethoven. There's a good story about how he had a bunch of copyists waiting to copy out the score of a new symphony, and he would write an autograph page, and he would bring it out to a copyist and hand it to them. Then he would go back to his room, throw up in a bucket, and sit down and write the next page. So he definitely suffered from a lot of vomiting. But general sluggishness does not characterize anything I've read about Beethoven's day-to-day life. Now, there was another issue called Paget's disease, and Beethoven was autopsied after he died, and the autopsy was performed by a creditable physician who said that Beethoven had an unusually thick skull. So symptoms of Paget's disease are pain, enlarged bones, and as I said, Beethoven's autopsy reported a thickened skull, and pinched nerves leading to tingling or numbness, which he did report, and hearing loss and headaches if the disease affects the skull. And Beethoven did complain of hearing loss and headaches, and so he may have had Paget's disease. So even though no one will ever really know for sure what caused Beethoven to go deaf, I feel like Paget's disease is probably the most likely cause. There's also this little piece of music that you will have heard for Elisa. I'm not hearing anything. Are you hearing it?
Yes, loud and clear.
Okay. That's a familiar piece, right? Well, the reason I bring it up is that Beethoven would be completely astonished that this piece of music was so famous because it was a throwaway thing that he wrote for a student that he had a crush on, Therese Malfatti. He did not have a student named Elisa. He didn't know anyone named Elisa, but he may have just used that as a nickname for this girl. Anyway, he wrote it for her. He sent it to her. He mentioned it in a letter, and it was discovered among her family's papers. That's the only reason we know of it. And it just amuses me that it's so well known now when Beethoven thought nothing of it. Going back to his deafness for a second, it isn't that hard to write music without hearing it. Because people say, well, how did Beethoven write music after he went deaf? Well, a well-trained musician learns how to hear music in their head and to sing a melody they've never heard. I remember when I was in music school, one of the courses that I had was called ear training and sight singing. And the point of it was to teach you to look at a melody and know how it sounded, even if you'd never heard it. And in fact, we had to sing melodies that we'd never heard before. They would put something in front of you and say, sing that, and you would have to sing it. So to have that ability, and remember, Beethoven didn't start going deaf until his late 20s when he was already an accomplished musician. So the idea that he could have continued to write music doesn't surprise me. What does surprise me is that and I think this is clearly quite admirable and evidence of his genius. His later music is not safe, not conventional, not what you might expect a person to do who is sticking with what he knew. It's daring and innovative, and that I think we can attribute to Beethoven's genius. I wanted to, if we have time, do we have time? Yeah, we do. To go into a little bit to a couple other things. There was the matter of this woman called the Immortal Beloved. He once wrote a heartfelt, heartrending letter to an unnamed woman. Here's an excerpt of it, if I can find it here. I think it's here. Yeah, there it is. Uh-huh. Uh-oh. What happened? I have lost it. Let me go back to where it was. This all look familiar? It should. Okay. There. From Beethoven's letter to the immortal beloved. I can't quite read my own screen here. Why is that? It's the emotional intensity I wanted to highlight. My angel, my very self. Why this profound sorrow when necessity speaks? Can our love endure without sacrifices, without our demanding everything one another? Can I change the fact that you are not wholly mine, that I am not wholly yours? Dear God, look at nature in all her beauty and set your heart at rest about what must be. Love demands all, and rightly so. No doubt we shall meet soon, and today also time fails me to tell you of the thoughts which during these last few days I have been revolving about my life. If our hearts were always closely united, I would certainly entertain no such thoughts, and so on. This is 1812. He's writing this to some woman, and he never sent it to her. But he was obviously very emotionally involved with this woman. Nobody knows who this woman was. Beethoven scholars like to speculate about it. There was even a movie about this incident, and the movie was called Immortal Beloved. And one Beethoven scholar, Lewis Lockwood, describes this as the nadir of Beethoven scholarship. So that's not encouraging, is it? But it's a curious incident in his life that he apparently was passionately taken with someone who it just never went anywhere, because he never married. He never really had an enduring relationship with a woman. So it's just a note about Beethoven. And one final thing, ironically, it may have been his deafness which led him to compose more. He had to give up performing, which created more opportunity and more economic necessity for composing. And I close by saying that a lot of what we know about Beethoven comes from three sources. He left sketchbooks of his works as they progressed, and in these one can trace his thought process as he worked. I have read that he often began with rather banal ideas, but reworked them mercilessly until they became great. For instance, that melody of the Ode to Joy, da 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 da. That it seems like a sort of indestructible melody, like it always must have existed. Beethoven worked a long time to write that melody, and it went through a lot of changes. And there are also the conversation books that I mentioned earlier, how people would have a conversation with him by writing down what they wanted to say, and he would answer it. In his later years, friends and visitors had to write down whatever they wished to say to him. Many of these books survive and record banalities as well as profundities and everything in between. And in beginning about the year 1812, he began to keep a diary. So those are the main sources for what we know about Beethoven. But I think if you look at him, he really was a transitional figure. The world changed around Beethoven very greatly as he pursued his creative career. And so that's one reason I find him such an interesting subject. Now, That's all I have to say. If there are any questions I can answer for anybody.
Richard, can you stop sharing screen?
Sure. If I can figure out how. Stop share. There we go. There.
Thanks.
Myra has a question. Why was improvising once encouraged or expected, but not today?
Well, that's a complicated question, but and at the time, I think music was not as hidebound as it is today. Today, if you changed a note in a Beethoven piece, that would be considered sacrilegious. But in his time, people were expected to improvise. And I've seen transcriptions of a piece of music, say by Mozart or Bach, where they show you the way it was printed, and then they show you how it would have been performed. And the performance takes great liberties with the whole with the notes on the page. So just like today, think of it like in terms of jazz. A jazz musician has a tune in front of them. Maybe it's a melody by George Gershwin. But the last thing they're expected to do is to play it the way it was written. It's played with all kinds of elaborations or variations introduced by the performer. And that's kind of the way a classical musician approached music at that time. They wanted to elaborate on what was on the page. Yes. Gloria Hoffman says, did he ever have a patron? Did he always earn money for playing and teaching? Beethoven lived at a time when patronage was not such a reliable way of supporting yourself anymore because of the revolution and various other reasons. So the aristocrats didn't have the money they had once had. So he supported himself in partly by the sales of sheet music, but also partly he got together three aristocrats who wanted him to stay in Vienna when he was threatening to leave, and said that they would all three contribute to an annual stipend for him if he would agree to stay in Vienna. So those three people all supported Beethoven, and yet that also enabled him to be free of the domination of any one particular aristocrat. So he could write what he wanted to when he wanted to and not worry about losing financial support in the process. Do you remember me saying that Haydn at one time was told by his patron, Nicholas Esterhazy, to not write the kind of music he was writing, so Haydn just stopped doing that. Beethoven didn't have that problem because of the fact that he was being supported by various people.
I always think of Beethoven as one of the most innovative musicians of composers ever. He basically, for me, invented a whole style of classical music that didn't exist before his time. Is there any thought about how he was able to do that? I mean, Symphony Number 5 is the beginning of Symphony Number 5 is just didn't exist. It didn't exist. You didn't write music that way before he wrote that. So any comment you can make about how he did that would be interesting for me.
I think partly it's a question of Beethoven's personality. He was very much going to do what he wanted to do and not worry about what anybody thought of it. And so he wrote music without regard to what patrons might want to hear or even audiences might want to hear. He wrote the music that he felt he should write. He saw himself as, in a sense, larger than life, that he expected his music to live on after him. So the question of style was not so much a problem for him. He was not trying to please the people of his own age. I don't know if that answers your question. I had another
I
thought.
don't know if there is an answer.
Yeah, I don't know either, but I think that um and remember he was a transitional figure too. He lived at a time when the classical era was on the way out and the romantic era was on the way in. And so he was a trailblazer in that sense. And so
Right.
he wrote what he wanted to write because it made sense to him.
The Farbers have a question. Why don't you unmute yourselves and then ask it?
Okay. Question and a comment. Yeah. Um, hi. This is Ruth and Barry Farber. I have just a question, and Barry has a comment, something he wants to share. So I just wanted to know the music that he made for a lover. Was that Fleur de Lis? What was that music?
I don't know that he wrote music particularly inspired by his love for this immortal beloved. I don't know that.
I thought I heard you play something that sounded familiar, and I didn't know what it was.
Well,
So
that was probably for Elisa. And for Elisa was not written for, well, if it was written for anyone, it was for a woman named Therese Malfatti, a teenager when Beethoven was her teacher, a piano teacher, and he had a crush on her. I think he actually asked her to marry him at one point, which was a typical pattern in his life. He would ask people to marry him, or like, no, that's not going to work. But he would inappropriately asking people to marry him. And Therese was one of those people. I know that I don't know that he wrote that piece of music for her. I know that he mentioned to her in a letter that he was sending her a little piece of music. And I know that he never published it himself in any shape or form. It was only we only know it existed because it was found in her own family's papers.
yeah, okay. Thank you so far for all the rich history that you're telling us. Barry's going to share something.
Some of you may know or have heard of from Beethoven's archive letters that he sent to his uncle, Carl. Beethoven lived in a number of places because of his irascible behavior. He had to move a lot, apparently. I'm not a student of music, but I read to a third grade class at the Henry School. And we go through this short book, and these are letters sent between where Beethoven was living and to his uncle. And the reason I chose this, because this has a lot to do with how we, no matter what our age is, have relationships, and there are characteristics of people that irk us. And in this particular story, which I'd be interested in if you know about him, although you talked about his personality characteristics, he was arrogant, irascible, difficult to get along with. But his uncle would always say to his nephew, it will work its way out. It will work its way out. So anyway, I thought it was very interesting for the students to.
You know, you're saying his uncle, but I suspect it was really his nephew. And Beethoven was the uncle because he had a famous relationship with his nephew, Carl. But I don't recall reading anything about a particular relationship with an uncle or other older relative of his. But the nephew, Carl, was the son of his brother, Carl. And Beethoven had such a strong aversion to Carl, the father's marriage to a woman named Johanna, that he fought in court to get legal control of Carl, the younger Carl, to get control of his legal status. He Beethoven became his legal guardian and raised Carl and educated him. And it was not a happy relationship. In fact, Carl attempted suicide at one point in his life, unfortunately, unsuccessfully. But it was a problem. But Beethoven had no children, and I think he probably really longed for an heir, somebody that he could, um, you know, feel had lived after him. I don't know. It's an interesting story. That Beethoven lives upstairs, I think was turned into some kind of a movie or a video or something.
Yeah, I think there's a video. It's a scholastic book. It's approved by the education division. I'm just reading here from March 10 of 1823. And once again, it's supposed to be from his archives. I have no knowledge of his archives. It says, "Dear Uncle," and it goes on to have a few paragraphs, and it says, "Yours truly, Christoph." And he and the uncle called, Beethoven called him the gatekeeper, because little Christoph, at the age of about 10, he would sit on the steps outside the home that where Beethoven was renting a room and watch the world go by. But anyway, I haven't looked at any of the archive. Have you looked at
either? And I don't know of a relative named Christoph, but
okay, I'm just going.
Okay.
This book. Anyway, it's a very entertaining book, and the children often write in their review of the class how they enjoyed learning about Beethoven. And in the third grade, they're also in orchestra. They're also in learning music.
Yeah.
They have a particular interest. And one kid in class the other day said he was in the mood, so he went to the internet somehow, and he was listening to the Fifth Symphony. So I took that.
Third grade at Henry School. It's very nice that
that's terrific. Well, the Fifth Symphony made a huge impression on me when I was a young man. I think I was in 7th or 8th grade.
Wow.
And I was in my music class in school. The music teacher introduced us to classical symphonies by means of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony.
Wow.
And it was a whole new world to me. So it was
there
great.
You go. Oh.
You know, I knew we weren't a musical family. The only sounds I heard were discord. But and be that as it may. Yeah, it's very profound, and I cherish this.
And they had a scene, whether that was true or not, there that he was playing his, maybe in the fifth, I'm not sure, but he couldn't hear it. He couldn't hear the applause until he turned around because of his deafness. It was kind of
that story is about the Ninth Symphony.
He
insisted on conducting the premiere of the Ninth Symphony, even though he was deaf as a post.
Oh.
And they had actually an alternate conductor standing behind him who was the real conductor of the orchestra.
Wow.
But when it was over, Beethoven did not know the audience was applauding, so they had to turn him around so he could see that they were applauding before he could understand that they really liked it. That was the Ninth Symphony, yeah.
It's very touching.
Yeah, and that's when this book is, the short book is written all about him writing the Ode to Joy, living in this home in Vienna.
But we'll find out whether it's true or not. Okay, another time. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Sure, you're welcome.
Hi, I just have an interesting anecdote about the almost universality of the Ode to Joy. In the 80s and 90s, I was a Central America human rights activist. And in 1993, in El Salvador, there was a peace agreement. And I wasn't there at that time. The next spring, I was there to observe the first elections. But I saw a video of the celebrations by the popular forces of the passage of this peace agreement, and I suddenly heard them and saw them singing this tune in Spanish, and I guess kept looking at them and seeing them sing in Spanish, and suddenly it dawned on me they're saying this to the tune of the Ode to Joy, and here are these Salvadoran revolutionaries, I mean, we want to call them that, and they're singing to the tune of Ode to Joy. I mean, and I could not understand whether I know some Spanish, but not enough to know what exactly they were saying. But it was just astonishing that they.
Yeah, because and two things about the Ode to Joy tune. When the Berlin Wall fell, Leonard Bernstein conducted an orchestral performance from Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, which features the Ode to Joy, because it seemed like the perfect piece of music for that situation of the end of repression and liberation. And another is that the Japanese who created the compact disc were such fans of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony that they determined the size of the disc had to be that a complete performance of Beethoven's Ninth could fit onto one disc. That was what determined the size of the compact disc.
Uh, yeah, I mean, I know they weren't singing Schiller's Ode to Joy. They were singing some of their own words, but I don't know what they were. But it was just amazing that they used this
But it's the same
wonderful.
tune.
Yeah.
And that's wonderful that Beethoven was able to write a tune that has that capacity to live on and to endure that kind of transformation.
And they had this look. They had this look of joy, in their faces. It was just wonderful just to watch.
Yeah, it's and I find it astonishing that somebody who could write the complex, challenging, jagged music of his later years, for instance, the Grosse Fuge that you heard a little bit of, could also write such a simple, basic, sturdy folk tune as the Ode to Joy tune. That's impressive. Well, thank you, Dan.
Oh, there's someone raising.
Okay, anyone else? Is there anything else we need to say?
Yeah, I have a question. So I remember hearing that Schiller, when he wrote the Ode to Joy, he really didn't want to use the German word for joy, which is Freude. He wanted to use the word Freiheit for freedom, but he was afraid of the censors because the Ode to Freedom would, reflect more of the ideals of the Enlightenment. So he substituted Freude for Freiheit. Do you know if that's true?
I don't, but I think it's a great story. I hope it's true. And I think I can see how the censors at the time might have objected more to the word freedom than to the word joy.
Right. Joy isn't political. Freedom is political.
Right. In fact, when I read the words that I showed you on the screen of the translation of Schiller's Ode to Joy, I think, how could the censors have objected to this? I don't understand. It doesn't seem very revolutionary to me.
Any other questions? Okay, Dina, do you have a question? Why don't you unmute and ask it?
I see in a comment from Ingrid Harris, as a child I learned joyful, joyful we adore thee, said Ode to Joy in church. That's right. A lot of hymnals have a setting of it.
Okay, last call for questions. Anybody else?
Oh, maybe I'm unmuted. Richard, do you have any clue as to why Beethoven wrote only one opera, why he wasn't inspired to write?
He only wrote one opera, I think, Dina, because his opera was not very successful. He had to revise it a number of times. In fact, originally it was called Leonore, not Fidelio. And he did not really have a sympathetic understanding of the human voice. Mozart seemed to understand intuitively what voices could do and couldn't do, and Beethoven didn't. A lot of his vocal range of writing is high in the range, or it's difficult, or it's hard to breathe. So he did not really have a good feel for writing for the human voice. So that's probably why he only wrote the one opera. My own guess.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Okay, well, it's 8 o'clock, a little after 8. Richard, thank you so much. This was
You're welcome.
even the second time. It was just fascinating.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity too.
And
Uh,
Richard, can you hear us? We really
Yes.
appreciate it too. It was really a nice presentation. That's me
Okay,
and
well,
Terry.
thank you, Jane and Terry. Good to see you.
And the music, da 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 da.
Yes,
My parents gave me a music box that played that in Japan.
I'll
And
bet.
strongest memories of my life.
And
box-
as I say, Beethoven would be flabbergasted to know how popular that tune is, because to him it was nothing.
Because the Japanese were making music boxes out of it.
Yeah, well, I remember somebody had a doorbell that I knew. You pressed their doorbell, and what you heard was da 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 da
That would
da.
be, we needed to do doorbell ourselves.
Yeah,
Thank
I'll
you,
bet.
Richard. That was
Okay.
really a nice thing for you to do.
I'm glad you could be here, Jane. That's great.
Thank you.
Before people leave, I just want to tell you about our next couple of programs that Northwest Village Network will be having. On February the 5th, we are going to have an online showing of the Kelly Writers Room, in which Lorene Carey, who wrote the play Lady Sitting, will do a talk. And the YouTube channel that it's going to be on was publicized in the latest bulletin, but it will be, more information will be forthcoming. And then on February 24th, we have a block of tickets to see her play, which is called Lady Sitting. And that information will be, it has been already circulated, and more will be coming again. So thank you again, everybody, and thank you especially, Richard. This was wonderful.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I've enjoyed it a lot.